heavy wooden door of the forge splintered inward before the heavy fists of the men outside could strike the timber again. Winona stumbled through the threshold, gasping for air, the towering frame of her body casting a massive, trembling shadow against the glowing embers of the anvil. A deep cut above her brow wept thick, dark blood, staining the heavy dust on her cheek and the solid red fabric of her simple dress. Behind her, the furious shouts of the mob echoed through the mountain pines, the torches of the angry men painting the black night with a frantic, violent light. They hunted her not because she had done wrong, but because she possessed a medicine they feared to understand. She turned her massive shoulders, clutching her woven bag to her heavy chest, bracing for the men to break through the entrance. She was a giant of a woman, a mountain of quiet resilience with wildly developed muscles. But tonight, the raw hatred of the valley had broken her spirit. Yet the truth behind the anger of the town was far more complicated than anyone imagined. There are deep wounds in this world that only the broken can truly heal. Stay until the end of this journey to uncover the dark secret she carried through the storm. Leave a comment to let me know where you are watching from tonight, just to see how far this memory travels across the wind. From the suffocating heat of the deep shadows, a figure stepped forward into the flickering light. Gideon was a mountain of muscle and scarred flesh, an aging blacksmith whose sheer physical size matched her own towering height. He wore a coarse fabric shirt with torn sleeves, the thick muscles of his arms bulging with a heavy, terrifying power. He did not ask her name. He did not demand an explanation for the blood on her face. The roar of the men outside grew louder, demanding the capture of the outcast, the wild healer who lived beyond the civilized borders. Gideon moved with heavy, deliberate slowness. It was a subtle, recurring habit, the quiet rhythm of a man constantly trying to contain an overwhelming physical power. He stepped between her and the open doorway, the wide, towering breadth of his body shielding her completely from the biting wind and the hateful eyes of the approaching mob. "Do not move," he rumbled, the deep sound vibrating within his broad, heavily muscled chest. Winona leaned against the cool stone of the interior wall, the massive muscles of her thighs and biceps trembling from absolute exhaustion. She was accustomed to being the largest soul in any room, a woman whose sheer physical presence intimidated ordinary men. Yet, looking at the broad back of the aging blacksmith, she felt strangely protected, entirely hidden behind the overwhelming barrier of his shoulders. The leaders of the mob reached the threshold, the flames of their torches hissing in the damp, cold mountain air. 3 men stood at the front, the eyes of the farmers wild with a feverish, blind panic. "Bring her out,"
"Blacksmith," the tallest man demanded,
the voice of the farmer cracking with an uncontrollable rage. "She brought the sickness to our children. She must answer for the dying." Gideon did not flinch. He reached down with one massive hand and lifted his heaviest iron hammer from the resting block. The heavy metal groaned as his thick fingers gripped the worn wooden handle. He stood perfectly still, his weathered, tanned face dark and serious beneath the tangled mess of his thick beard. The sharp, masculine features of his face betrayed no fear, only a cold, unshakable boundary line. "The forge is closed," he breathed, the low tone of his voice sounding like the dangerous warning rumble of a distant rockslide. "You will return to your homes. You will not cross this threshold." "She is a witch," another man spat, raising a rusted pitchfork toward the sky. "She poisoned the water of the river. We found her tools near the muddy bank." "I will speak only once more," Gideon murmured, lifting the heavy hammer a fraction of an inch from the dirt. The next man who steps onto the ground of my forge will not walk away from it. Fear is a strange, unpredictable poison. It turns simple men into predators and gentle neighbors into ruthless strangers. But true courage is much quieter. Courage is the steady, enduring heat of a forge on a dark night, standing firm when the rest of the world has gone mad. The men looked at the heavy iron hammer. They looked at the bulging, heavily veined muscles of the arms of the massive blacksmith. Slowly, the violent fever in the eyes of the men began to break, replaced by the cold, sobering reality of the violence he promised to unleash. They muttered dark, bitter curses into the wind, lowered the burning torches, and began to retreat into the shadows of the tall pines. Gideon waited until the chaotic sound of their heavy boots faded completely into the silence of the mountain. He set the hammer down with a heavy thud that shook the floorboards. He pushed the heavy wooden door closed, sliding a thick iron beam across the frame to lock the cruel hatred of the world safely outside. The rhythmic hiss of hot embers settling into the soft ash filled the quiet space. The smell of rain, iron rust, and old sweat hung heavy in the warm air. Winona slid down the rough stone wall, sitting on the dirt floor, her long, messy light brown hair falling across her strong, resolute face. The massive frame of her body heaved as she finally allowed her lungs to breathe freely. Gideon turned to face her. He walked over to a wooden bucket resting near the water barrel. He took a clean piece of coarse fabric, dipped the cloth into the cool, clear water, and walked slowly back to her. He knelt before her on one knee, his massive frame taking up the entire space of the narrow corner. Without a single spoken word, he extended his large hand and offered the wet cloth to her. Winona hesitated. The strong lines of her feminine face softened as she looked deeply into the sharp, perceptive eyes of the aging man. She took the cloth, her large, calloused fingers accidentally brushing against the rough knuckles of his hand. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, yet it carried the heavy, profound weight of shared understanding. They were two massive giants, two lonely outcasts, heavily marked by the dust and the unforgiving grime of a cruel frontier. She pressed the soothing, cool fabric to the bleeding cut above her brow. Gideon did not stare. He gave her the profound dignity of privacy. He stood up, turned his massive back to her, and walked slowly to the hearth. He pushed a heavy oak log deep into the fire, deliberately stoking the warm flames to chase away the terrible chill of the storm, ensuring the gentle warmth of the room wrapped securely around her shivering shoulders. Winona closed her tired eyes, the gentle, radiant heat of the roaring fire sinking deep into her weary bones. For the first time in many difficult years, she felt an undeniable, overwhelming sense of absolute emotional safety. After a long moment of peace, she opened the woven fabric of her medicine bag to check the fragile glass vials inside, needing to ensure the frantic escape had not broken her precious supplies. Her large hands brushed gently past the dried bundles of fragrant sage and willow bark, stopping suddenly near the deep bottom of the pouch. Her fingers touched the cold, unnatural, heavy shape of a strange object, hidden beneath the healing herbs. She stared down into the dark opening of the bag, the terrifying memory of the night, returning with a sharp, confusing sting. What specific, dangerous item hidden away inside the bag of the healer drove the town to such sudden, blinding hatred tonight? The heavy, unnatural object remained hidden at the dark bottom of the woven bag. Winona pulled her hand away from the cold surface, concealing the corrupted, dark river stone beneath the fragrant bundles of dried mountain sage. She knew the undeniable truth of the sickness poisoning the families of the valley, and the corrupted stone was the only physical proof of the dangerous poison. She tied the thick leather straps of the bag tightly together, choosing to keep the terrible secret safe for another night. The frantic beating of her heart began to slow, but the heavy muscles of her massive thighs still trembled from the exhausting run through the mud. The heavy, terrifying roar of the angry mob faded entirely into the relentless rhythm of the freezing mountain rain, hammering against the wooden roof of the secluded forge. Gideon stood like a silent mountain of stone near the roaring fire. The sharp smell of wet coarse wool and raw rust mingled heavily with the thick wood smoke. The immense heat of the flames baked the dampness from the coarse fabric of his ruined shirt. He reached up with massive, heavy arms and pulled the torn, wet garment over his head, casting the ruined fabric aside onto a wooden bench. The sheer physical size of the man was overwhelming. The broad, muscular expanse of his bare shoulders and the thick, bulging muscles of his back glowed brightly in the flickering orange light of the hearth. However, the flesh of his massive back was not smooth. Thick, raised lines of terrible burn scars carved a cruel, jagged map across the heavy muscles. The scars were old, yet the ridges looked angry and inflamed from the brutal, physical labor of the long day and the relentless heat of the roaring forge. Gideon did not look back at the shivering woman. He moved around the heavy anvil with deliberate slowness, a subtle, recurring habit born from the constant necessity of containing his overwhelming physical power in a fragile world. He stepped heavily over to a large wooden chest resting near the far stone wall. He opened the heavy iron hinges of the lid, pulled out a thick wool blanket, and walked silently toward the corner. He laid the heavy blanket gently across the towering, muscular shoulders of the wild woman, ensuring the thick fabric covered her shivering, massive arms completely. The gesture was simple, yet it carried a profound, undeniable weight of quiet care. "The storm will not pass until morning," he rumbled, returning to his heavy iron anvil to arrange the scattered iron tools. "You will sleep near the warmth of the fire." Winona looked down at the thick wool blanket, feeling the profound warmth of the kind gesture soaking into her tired bones. She then looked back at the inflamed, terrible scars crisscrossing the massive back of the solitary blacksmith. The sacred instinct of the healer was a powerful, undeniable calling, stronger than her physical exhaustion, stronger than her lingering fear of the violent men outside. She opened the woven leather bag once more. She bypassed the corrupted river stone and carefully withdrew a small, precious clay jar. Inside the heavy jar rested a rare, potent balm made from crushed silver leaf and golden pine resin. It was the very last of her sacred medicine, a complex mixture requiring many difficult months to prepare. Yet she did not hesitate to offer the valuable cure. "The heavy heat of the forge brings anger to old wounds," she murmured, her voice soft and melodic, echoing with the quiet rhythm of the deep forests. "The skin of your back requires immediate cooling." Gideon stopped moving. The massive, heavy muscles of his arms tensed like thick ropes of steel. He turned his weathered, tanned face slightly, looking at her over his broad, scarred shoulder. The sharp, serious features of his face remained stoic, but a sudden flicker of absolute surprise flashed within his dark, intense eyes. He was a giant accustomed to fear, a man who expected only the cold cruelty of the harsh frontier. Pain is a silent companion for those who live on the forgotten edges of the map. Solitary men like the blacksmith wear their suffering like heavy iron armor, trusting no living soul to see the soft, vulnerable flesh beneath the terrible scars. To accept healing is to accept true vulnerability. To allow the gentle touch of another soul is to admit that the heavy armor is exhausting, and the quiet spirit is tired of fighting the darkness alone. The world had taught them both that survival meant building tall walls of stone around the heart. Yet, in the quiet solitude of the warm forge, those heavy walls began to show the first fragile cracks of trust. "I do not require pity," he breathed, gripping the heavy wooden handle of a resting hammer. "It is not pity," Winona whispered softly, pushing herself up from the dusty dirt floor. She stood to her full, towering height, her massive, wildly muscular frame casting a long, powerful shadow across the scattered stones. "It is medicine, and medicine belongs to those who carry pain." She stepped closer to the radiant warmth of the raging fire. She gathered a small amount of the fragrant, green balm onto the thick, calloused fingers of her large hand. The sharp, clean scent of crushed pine and winter mint instantly filled the stifling, metallic air of the quiet forge. She stood closely behind the massive blacksmith, her quiet, steady presence offering a profound, undeniable sense of emotional safety. Gideon released his tight grip on the hammer. He closed his tired eyes and slowly lowered his heavy head, a silent submission to the gentle will of the giant woman. Winona reached out. The large, strong fingers of the healer pressed gently against the inflamed, scarred flesh of his broad back. The contrast between their massive physical power and the absolute gentleness of the quiet moment was a beautiful, silent miracle. She worked the cooling balm slowly into the deep ridges of the burns. Her touch was firm yet completely devoid of harm, erasing the agonizing sting of the old wounds. Gideon let out a long, heavy breath, the broad expanse of his chest falling as the deep, lingering tension finally began to leave his exhausted body. The soothing medicine absorbed into the weathered skin, bringing an undeniable relief to muscles that had known nothing but punishing labor for many long years. As she traced the outer edges of the thick, raised marks, her sensitive fingers recognized a deliberate, unnatural pattern. These were not the random scars of a terrible accidental fire. The brutal burns formed a specific, cruel shape, a brand struck intentionally into the flesh by a heavy iron tool. The horrifying realization sent a cold chill through the compassionate heart of the healer. She continued to apply the soothing medicine, maintaining the quiet, respectful silence of the warm room. But the terrifying mystery burned brightly in her mind. Who inflicted the terrible branding scars on the massive back of the aging blacksmith? And why did the silent, powerful giant refuse to speak of the men who marked him like a wild beast? The pale, gray light of the dawn crept slowly across the cold dirt floor of the quiet sanctuary. The violent storm of the long night had passed, leaving behind a heavy, damp silence in the deep valley. Winona stirred beneath the thick wool blanket. The massive muscles of her towering frame ached deeply from the brutal, terrifying escape, but the profound warmth of the glowing hearth still radiated through the quiet space. She opened her eyes, adjusting to the soft morning light filtering through the narrow gaps of the timber walls. The sharp, earthy smell of roasted coffee beans mingled deeply with the scent of wet iron, cold rain, and soft wood ash. This was the vivid, undeniable sensory reality of a safe morning. Gideon stood near the heavy iron anvil. He wore a dry, coarse fabric shirt, the rough sleeves rolled high to reveal the thick, bulging muscles of his massive forearms. The silent blacksmith moved with a deliberate, recurring slowness, carefully lifting a blackened tin pot from the hot stones of the fire. He poured the dark, steaming liquid into two simple metal cups. He turned his weathered, tanned face toward the shadowed corner, offering a quiet, gentle nod of morning greeting. He walked over and handed one cup to the giant woman. The simple, quiet sharing of the warm drink was a profound rhythm of care. Winona accepted the warm metal, her large, calloused fingers wrapping securely around the heat. The unspoken gesture provided an overwhelming sense of emotional safety. She felt the heavy tension leaving the powerful muscles of her broad shoulders. Before she could bring the dark liquid to her lips, the heavy, rhythmic thud of approaching hooves shattered the peaceful morning. The sound was sharp, demanding, and entirely unwelcome. The heavy wooden door shook under 3 violent, authoritative knocks. "Open the door." Blacksmith, a loud, arrogant voice commanded from the other side of the heavy timber. "It is the law." Gideon did not flinch. The massive, heavily veined muscles of his bare arms tensed. He set his metal cup down onto the heavy iron block with a quiet, deliberate click. He turned his broad shoulders toward the entrance, his masculine, angular face hardening into a terrifying wall of cold stone. Winona stood up quickly, the thick wool blanket falling away from the solid red fabric of her simple dress. Cold fear gripped the heavy muscles of her massive chest. She recognized the harsh, unforgiving voice of the town lawman. "Stay in the deep shadows," Gideon rumbled, the low bass of his steady voice offering a solid, unshakable comfort. He stepped toward the entrance, lifting the heavy iron beam from the strong wooden frame. He pulled the heavy door open, stepping out into the cold, damp mud of the morning yard. Winona remained entirely hidden in the dim light of the interior, watching the massive, protective back of the solitary giant. The town lawman sat atop a tall, restless gray stallion. The lawman wore a long, dark coat, his right hand resting dangerously near the heavy leather holster of his weapon. Behind the tall stallion, the thick mountain fog rolled quietly through the towering pines. "The town is demanding justice," the lawman stated, his dark eyes narrowing as he looked up at the towering, wildly muscular physique of the solitary blacksmith. The furious farmers tracked the wild woman to this property. "Hand the healer over to the law." Gideon stepped further into the cold light. He reached down to the heavy wooden block near the open entrance. His massive fingers closed around the thick wooden handle of his heaviest striking hammer. He lifted the massive iron tool, resting the heavy metal head casually against the thick muscles of his broad shoulder. The sheer physical size of the aging giant was absolutely terrifying to behold in the clear light of the day. "There is no one here for the town to take," Gideon breathed. The voice of the giant was not loud. It was low, dangerous, and entirely devoid of fear. "Do not play the fool," the lawman sneered, tightening his grip on the leather reins. "The giant woman brings nothing but ruin. The people of the valley are sick. The horrible fever is spreading. The people believe the wild healer poisoned the pure water of the river. Give the outcast to the law, and the town will forgive the trespass." Winona listened from the deep shadows. The profound cruelty of the world outside was a heavy, suffocating weight upon her quiet soul. She had spent her entire life trying to heal the broken flesh of others, yet the ignorant town chose only to see a dangerous monster. The strong lines of her resolute face tightened, a deep, painful sorrow settling permanently into the compassionate heart of the survivor. She expected the blacksmith to step aside. She expected the solitary man to choose the easy path of the quiet life. Men of the rugged frontier rarely risked personal safety for the dignity of an outcast. Gideon did not step aside. He stepped entirely forward, closing the short distance between the mud of the yard and the restless gray stallion. He brought the heavy iron hammer down from his massive shoulder, gripping the thick wooden handle with both of his massive hands. He stood like an immovable mountain of unyielding stone, a perfect, physical shield between the cruel hatred of the town and the gentle healer hidden inside the forge. "The boundary of my land begins at the deep river crossing," Gideon murmured, his sharp, serious eyes locking onto the nervous face of the lawman. "You have crossed the boundary line. Turn the horse around. Do not return to this property. You cannot protect the wild woman forever," the lawman snapped, pulling the reins of the gray stallion backward. The nervous animal stepped quickly away from the terrifying presence of the massive blacksmith. "The town will not rest until the wicked witch burns. Then the town will burn first," Gideon replied quietly. The simple, absolute certainty of the spoken threat hung heavily in the cold morning mist. Protection is a rare and beautiful gift in a harsh, unforgiving land. For the giant, muscular woman who had spent a lifetime defending her own life against the cruel prejudices of a harsh world, the sight of the unyielding protector was a profound, life-changing revelation. She realized, standing in the quiet safety of the shadowed corner, that she did not have to fight the heavy battles of the world alone. The mutual respect between the two solitary giants was forging a deep, unbreakable bond of true emotional reliance. The lawman glared at the unmoving, towering blacksmith. The lawman knew the brutal, overwhelming strength of the massive iron worker. The lawman knew a violent physical confrontation would end in absolute tragedy for the fragile men of the town. With a bitter, angry curse, the lawman turned the heavy head of the gray stallion toward the muddy trail, leading back to the valley. "Keep the outcast," the lawman shouted over the heavy wind, the voice of the frightened man echoing with a strange, dark panic. "But the terrible plague of the river is coming for the high ground. Do not think the deep water will spare the quiet forge. The true sickness is already beneath the mud." Gideon watched the lawman ride away into the thick morning fog. The giant blacksmith stood perfectly still until the heavy sound of the hooves disappeared completely. He turned his massive body around, walking slowly back into the warm safety of the interior room. He set the heavy iron hammer down onto the dirt. He looked across the glowing embers of the hearth, his dark eyes finding the strong, feminine face of the hidden healer. He gave a single, gentle nod of absolute reassurance. The profound, quiet warmth of the simple gesture cemented the unspoken, iron promise of safety. Yet, the cryptic, terrifying warning of the angry lawman lingered heavily in the damp air. The town believed the pure water of the valley carried a mysterious sickness. The town blamed the wild healer for the rapidly spreading fever. What horrifying truth did the terrified town know about the deep river? And what dark secret were the people hiding beneath the cold mud? The heavy silence following the departure of the angry lawman settled deeply into the damp timber of the quiet forge. The dark warning regarding the buried sickness of the river lingered in the cold mist. Yet inside the massive stone walls, a profound, undeniable peace began to take root. The terrifying world outside demanded violence and blind anger, but the solitary sanctuary of the aging blacksmith offered only the steady, comforting rhythm of honest labor. Winona watched from the dim shadows as Gideon returned to the heavy iron anvil. The towering giant of a man moved with his deliberate, recurring slowness, a quiet rhythm masking an overwhelming, terrifying physical power. He lifted a long pair of heavy iron tongs, drawing a glowing rod of raw metal from the roaring heart of the raging fire. The blinding orange light illuminated the massive, bulging muscles of his thick forearms and the weathered, serious lines of his masculine face. He raised the heavy striking hammer, bringing the solid iron down against the glowing metal with a thunderous, rhythmic crash. The loud ringing of the heavy anvil did not frighten the giant healer. To the sensitive soul of the outcast woman, the heavy sound was a beautiful, protective heartbeat. It was the absolute physical proof of an unyielding barrier, existing safely between her fragile hope and the cruel hatred of the valley. She turned her careful attention to the scattered contents of the woven leather bag. She arranged the fragrant bundles of dried mountain sage, winter mint, and bitter willow bark upon a long wooden bench. The massive, wildly muscular thighs and broad shoulders of the towering woman contrasted deeply with the delicate, precise movements of her large, calloused fingers. She possessed the sheer physical strength to break a wild horse, yet she handled the fragile, tiny seeds of the healing plants with absolute, profound gentleness. They worked together in a shared, comfortable silence for many long hours. Words are often fragile things, easily broken by dark misunderstandings and old fears. For the two lonely giants marked heavily by the unforgiving frontier, deep trust was not built upon empty promises. Trust was built upon the quiet, undeniable language of shared survival. As the heavy iron hammer shaped the stubborn metal, Winona gathered a small pile of edible roots and dried meat from the meager supplies of the quiet forge. She filled a heavy cast iron pot with clean water from the deep rain barrel, hanging the dark vessel safely over the secondary fire near the back stone wall. She sliced the thick roots with a small, sharp blade, adding the earthy vegetables and the salted meat to the warming water. She sprinkled a pinch of wild river thyme into the bubbling broth, the homemaking skills of the wise healer transforming this simple, rough supplies into a deeply nourishing meal. The sharp, savory scent of the rich stew slowly filled the stifling, metallic air of the warm room, mingling perfectly with the sharp tang of hot ash and raw iron. Gideon paused his loud, heavy labor. The massive blacksmith lowered the thick wooden handle of the hammer. The broad, heavily scarred chest of the solitary man rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. He turned his weathered, tanned face toward the warm scent, a subtle, quiet expression of absolute gratitude softening the sharp, serious angles of his dark eyes. He walked slowly to the wooden water barrel, washing the dark soot and the heavy sweat from the thick skin of his massive hands. Winona filled a carved wooden bowl with the steaming, rich broth. She walked across the rough dirt floor, the heavy leather boots of her massive feet making no loud sound. She offered the warm bowl to the quiet protector. Gideon accepted the simple meal, his large, rough fingers brushing gently against the calloused hands of the quiet healer. The fleeting touch sent a profound, undeniable warmth through the heavy muscles of his tired body. He sat heavily upon a thick wooden block near the glowing hearth, eating the nourishing food in a respectful, profound silence. Winona sat upon the dirt floor near the radiating heat, holding a second warm bowl in her large hands. True belonging is not found in the crowded, noisy streets of a wealthy town. True belonging is forged quietly in the forgotten corners of the dark world, shared purely between two broken souls who understand the heavy weight of true sorrow. As they shared the quiet, simple meal, the immense emotional distance between the two outcasts began to vanish entirely. The damp afternoon slowly bled into the deep purple shadows of the cold evening. The relentless mountain rain finally ceased, leaving behind a heavy, dripping silence in the towering pines. Gideon stood up from the wooden block. He walked back to the heavy anvil, picking up a small, cooling piece of dark iron. He had not been forging a weapon or a heavy tool during the long afternoon. He walked slowly back to the wooden bench where the wild woman sat. He placed the newly forged object upon the rough timber beside the fragrant bundles of dried sage. It was a perfect, intricate iron hook, shaped beautifully with the delicate curve of a mountain vine. It was a simple, sturdy tool designed specifically or hanging the heavy bundles of the healer from the thick timber rafters of the roof. Winona looked at the small, beautiful gift. A profound, overwhelming rush of pure emotion tightened the heavy muscles of her broad chest. For many long years, the cruel world had offered her only sharp stones and hateful fire. To receive a deliberate, thoughtful creation crafted by the massive hands of the gentle giant was a beautiful, life-changing revelation. She looked up into the dark, serious eyes of the protective blacksmith, the strong, resolute face of the survivor glowing with an unspoken, deep admiration. "The high rafters will keep the dampness away from the delicate leaves," Gideon murmured. The deep, vibrating sound of his low voice carrying a profound, quiet warmth. "The iron is beautiful," she breathed. The melodic voice of the giant woman trembling slightly with heavy emotion. "I will hang the medicine near the warmth of the rising smoke." Gideon offered a single, respectful nod. He turned his massive shoulders toward the heavy wooden door. The cryptic warning of the angry lawman remained heavily upon his quiet mind. The lawman spoke of a terrible sickness beneath the cold mud, a poison moving toward the high ground. Gideon needed to inspect the deep trench marking the boundary of the isolated property, ensuring the contaminated runoff of the valley could not reach the pure well of the quiet forge. He lifted a heavy iron shovel from the dark corner, unbarring the thick timber door. He stepped out into the cold, wet dusk. The thick mountain fog curled around the heavy leather boots of the solitary giant as he walked toward the distant edge of the dark property. The soft, muddy ground squelched loudly beneath his immense weight. He reached the deep trench near the base of an ancient, towering pine tree. The rushing water from the upper ridge pooled heavily in the dark dirt. He plunged the sharp metal blade of the heavy shovel deep into the wet earth, clearing the blocked passage to allow the dark water to drain. On the third heavy strike, the iron blade of the shovel did not cut through the soft mud. The tool struck a solid, unyielding object buried deep beneath the tangled roots of the ancient tree. A dull, heavy metallic clank echoed through the quiet, misty air. Gideon frowned, the thick, dark beard of his sharp face shifting as he tightened his massive jaw. He dug the soft mud away with his heavy hands, pulling the wet earth back to reveal the hidden obstacle. Resting quietly in the deep, cold mud was a strange, heavy iron box, completely covered in thick layers of old, green rust. It was unnatural, deliberately hidden, and entirely out of place in the wild mountain dirt. He gripped the heavy, rusted handle of the iron container, the thick muscles of his massive arms bulging as he pulled the heavy box free from the clinging mud. The mysterious object was sealed tightly with a thick, heavy padlock. What terrifying, dark secret was locked inside the strange, heavy iron box the aging blacksmith unearthed near the dark boundary line at dusk? The heavy iron box landed upon the rough dirt floor of the quiet forge with a dull, sickening thud. Gideon wiped the dark, wet mud from the thick muscles of his bare forearms, staring down at the thick layers of green rust covering the heavy padlock. The deep grooves of his weathered, tanned face tightened with a heavy, unspoken concern. The cryptic warning of the town lawman echoed darkly in his quiet mind. The terrible secret of the valley was literally buried beneath the heavy roots at the boundary of his isolated property. Winona stood near the glowing hearth, the solid red fabric of her simple dress catching the bright, flickering light of the flames. The massive, wildly muscular stature of the giant woman cast a long, protective shadow across the scattered stones. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, her large, calloused feet making no loud sound upon the soft dirt. The metal is old, she murmured, her melodic voice echoing softly in the warm, metallic air. The earth has held the heavy box for many long years. Before Gideon could reach for a heavy iron chisel to break the stubborn lock, a frantic, desperate scratching shattered the quiet peace of the midnight hour. The noise came from the heavy timber of the front entrance. It was not the loud, arrogant pounding of the dangerous mob. It was the terrified, weak clawing of a frightened, desperate animal seeking immediate shelter. Gideon stood to his full, towering height. He moved with his deliberate, recurring slowness, a quiet rhythm designed to completely suppress his overwhelming physical power. He stepped entirely away from the rusted box, walking heavily toward the thick timber door. He did not lift the heavy striking hammer. He unbarred the thick iron beam and pulled the heavy door open, facing the freezing, violent wind of the dark mountain storm. Standing in the freezing mud of the yard was a frail, trembling young woman. She clutched a heavy wool blanket tightly against her thin, shivering chest. The frantic eyes of the young mother were wide with absolute, blinding terror. The freezing mountain rain soaked completely through the thin fabric of her torn shawl, but she did not seem to feel the biting cold. "Please," the young mother wept, the desperate voice cracking with a profound, heavy sorrow. "The doctor of the town turned us away. The doctor claims the medicine is gone. The terrible fever is burning the breath from the lungs of my innocent child." Gideon looked down at the tiny, fragile bundle hidden beneath the wet wool. The giant blacksmith possessed massive hands designed to crush heavy stone and shape solid iron. Yet the solitary man understood the sacred, beautiful fragility of innocent life. He stepped backward into the shadows, opening the heavy timber door completely. He offered a silent, profound sanctuary to the terrified mother, ignoring the cruel, unforgiving laws of the angry town. The young mother stumbled blindly into the stifling heat of the quiet forge. She froze in absolute terror when she saw the towering, wildly muscular physique of the outcast healer stepping forward from the deep shadows. The hateful farmers of the town had painted Winona as a dangerous, wicked monster. The mother pulled the heavy bundle tighter against her chest, paralyzed by a sudden, overwhelming fear. "Do not fear the giant woman," Gideon breathed softly. His low, vibrating voice wrapping around the frightened mother, like a thick, protective shield. "The hands of the healer carry only gentle medicine." Winona stepped fully into the glowing light of the roaring hearth. She did not speak words of defense. She reached out with her massive, heavily calloused hands. The young mother hesitated, the heavy weight of lifelong prejudice, fighting a brutal war against the desperate, overwhelming love for her dying infant. Slowly, tears streaming heavily down her pale face, the mother surrendered the wet wool bundle to the towering outcast. Winona carried the tiny infant toward the radiating warmth of the stone hearth. The profound physical contrast was deeply staggering. The massive, wildly muscular thighs and the broad, powerful shoulders of the giant woman dwarfed the tiny, fragile body of the sick child. Yet, the delicate, precise movements of the giant healer were a beautiful, silent miracle of absolute grace. She cradled the burning infant against her chest, her strong, resolute face softening into a portrait of pure, divine compassion. True strength does not roar loudly into the wind. True strength does not break the fragile bones of the weak. True strength is the remarkable ability to hold the most fragile, broken piece of the cruel world in massive, powerful hands and choose only to protect it. Gideon stood silently near the heavy anvil, watching the wild woman work the sacred medicine. A deep, profound admiration swelled within the scarred, heavy chest of the aging blacksmith. The stoic, solitary man had spent a brutal lifetime destroying his own body to survive the harsh frontier. But watching the giant healer soothe the crying child, the aging giant realized true beauty existed solely in the gentle preservation of fragile life. The heavy emotional distance between the two massive outcasts shattered entirely in the quiet warmth of the miraculous moment. Winona opened the woven leather bag. She crushed the dried leaves of the winter mint and the fragrant mountain sage into a fine, aromatic powder. She mixed the green powder with a few drops of the pure water from the clean barrel, creating a soothing, cool paste. She rubbed the gentle medicine delicately onto the burning forehead and the tiny, trembling chest of the sick infant. She hummed a low, melodic rhythm of the deep forests, a sacred, ancient song of healing learned from the lost, forgotten tribe of her distant youth. The quiet forge became a holy sanctuary of absolute peace. The sharp smell of wet wool, fragrant mint, and hot wood ash filled the warm air. This was the vivid, undeniable sensory reality of true salvation. Gideon stepped closer through the dim light, placing a heavy, warm hand gently upon the trembling shoulder of the terrified mother. The simple, quiet gesture of the massive blacksmith offered an undeniable, overwhelming comfort to the weeping woman. Slowly, the terrible, rattling breath of the infant began to ease. The bright, angry red flush faded entirely from the tiny cheeks. The painful crying ceased, replaced beautifully by the soft, rhythmic breathing of a deep, peaceful sleep. The heavy, dangerous fever was finally broken. The young mother collapsed to her knees upon the soft dirt floor, sobbing with absolute, profound gratitude. She reached out with shaking hands, grasping the rough, solid hem of the red dress of the giant healer. The cruel prejudices of the wealthy town vanished entirely in the face of the undeniable miracle. You saved the innocent life, the mother breathed, looking up into the strong, beautiful face of the towering outcast. The people of the valley are blind fools. The furious men blame you for the wicked sickness. Winona handed the sleeping infant carefully back to the weeping mother. The massive healer possessed a compassionate heart completely devoid of bitter revenge. The sickness does not come from the pure magic of the deep forest, Winona murmured quietly, her gentle voice carrying a heavy, ancient wisdom. The sudden fever burns the body with an unnatural, dark heat. The young mother stood up, holding her sleeping child tightly against her chest. A dark, terrifying realization washed over the pale face of the frightened woman. She looked toward the scattered stones of the hearth, her frantic eyes finding the sharp, serious face of the aging blacksmith. The wealthy doctor of the town refuses to speak the terrible truth, the mother whispered, her voice trembling with a new, horrifying fear. But I tasted the water of the river before the terrible fever took my child. The water does not taste like the clean mud of the green valley. The water tastes exactly like heavy sulfur, burnt iron, and the dark, bitter ash of the high mountain. Gideon felt a sudden, freezing chill run violently through the thick, heavily scarred muscles of his broad back. He looked down at the rusted, heavy iron box resting in the dark dirt near his heavy leather boots. The terrible warning of the angry lawman, the buried iron container, and the terrifying taste of the contaminated water all pointed toward a horrifying, catastrophic reality. What dark, catastrophic poison was truly bleeding into the pure river of the valley? And what terrible, unforgivable connection did the rusted iron box hold to the dark, hidden past of the aging blacksmith? The horrifying realization, spoken by the young mother, hung heavily within the warm, metallic air of the quiet sanctuary. The terrible sickness of the valley was not born of wicked magic or wild curses. The poison flowed directly from the dark, bitter water of the river. Gideon escorted the young mother and the sleeping infant out into the freezing darkness, wrapping an extra piece of thick wool around the fragile shoulders of the woman to ensure a safe journey back to the deep valley. When the towering giant returned to the heavy anvil, the gray light of the true morning finally broke through the heavy canopy of the mountain pines. The sharp, clean scent of the washed earth struggled to overpower the unnatural, dark smell of burnt sulfur drifting on the cold wind. Inside the forge, a profound, quiet rhythm resumed. Winona carefully folded the heavy blankets, her massive, wildly muscular thighs moving with a gentle, graceful precision. She placed the delicate glass vials of her woven bag onto the high wooden bench, ensuring the fragile tools of the healer remained safe from the heavy boots of the solitary man. Gideon moved toward the water barrel. He filled a clean metal cup and carried the cool water across the rough dirt floor. He offered the simple drink to the towering woman. This was a quiet, undeniable warmth beat between the two heavy souls. Their massive hands did not touch, yet the profound emotional connection anchored the vast space between them. Winona accepted the cup, the strong, resolute lines of her feminine face softening into an expression of absolute, quiet gratitude. She recognized the undeniable truth of the moment. The aging blacksmith was not merely protecting her physical life. He was offering a profound, safe harbor for her weary spirit. Before the quiet outcasts could share the simple morning meal, the heavy, chaotic rumble of wooden wagon wheels shattered the fragile peace of the deep forest. The heavy sound of marching boots and shouting voices echoed violently against the wet timber of the secluded property. The frightened mob of the angry valley had returned. Gideon set his metal tools upon the solid iron block. He turned his weathered, tanned face toward the closed timber entrance. The thick, dark beard of the solitary man bristled as the massive, bulging muscles of his thick neck tightened. He unbarred the heavy door, stepping entirely out into the pale morning light. Winona followed closely behind the massive protector. She stood at the threshold of the open doorway, the solid red fabric of her simple dress highlighting the immense physical power of her broad shoulders and heavily developed biceps. She looked past the massive back of the aging blacksmith. Gathered at the deep trench marking the boundary of the isolated property was a desperate, chaotic crowd. They did not hold burning torches in the morning light. They held sick, shivering children wrapped tightly in damp blankets. The tall farmer from the previous night stood at the front of the frantic group. He gripped a small, empty glass vial in his shaking hand. Word of the miraculous recovery of the infant had traveled rapidly through the desperate homes of the valley. "We do not seek violence today," Blacksmith, the tall farmer, shouted over the rising wind, his voice trembling with a frantic, desperate fear. "The child of the baker breathes easy. The fever of the infant is broken. The town requires the green paste. Hand the medicine over to the families. The giant witch is forbidden from crossing the bridge, but the town will take the cure. The cruel world is a terrible, unforgiving marketplace. The wealthy and the pure routinely demand the sacred labor of the broken outcasts. Yet the comfortable citizens refuse to offer a single coin of human dignity in return. The frightened people of the valley demanded the miraculous healing of the wild woman. Yet they continued to look upon her towering, dusty form with absolute, blind disgust. They desired the salvation of the medicine, but they deeply despised the calloused, heavy hands of the gentle healer. Gideon stood like an unyielding mountain of absolute stone. He moved with his deliberate, recurring slowness, a quiet, profound rhythm designed entirely to suppress the terrifying, raw violence sleeping within his massive, bodybuilder physique. He reached down and lifted the heaviest iron-striking hammer from the muddy yard. He walked slowly toward the deep trench. He stopped directly before the frantic crowd. He lowered the heavy head of the solid iron tool into the wet earth. With a massive, powerful pull of his thick, heavily veined arms, he dragged the heavy metal through the deep mud. He carved a thick, undeniable boundary line across the entire width of the muddy trail. "The medicine belongs to the healer," Gideon rumbled. The dangerous, low bass of his steady voice echoing over the frantic cries of the desperate crowd. "You will not take the medicine. You will ask the healer for the medicine." The tall farmer recoiled, absolute shock replacing the arrogant demand upon his pale face. "You will speak to the giant woman with the profound respect of a human soul," Gideon continued, resting the heavy hammer against the thick muscles of his broad shoulder. "You will look the gentle healer in the eyes, and you will beg for the salvation of your children. If you refuse to offer the woman pure dignity, the town will choke on the bitter water." Winona watched from the wooden threshold, the heavy breath catching painfully in her broad chest. For the giant, muscular survivor who had endured a brutal lifetime of cruel whispers and thrown stones, the sight of the massive blacksmith demanding absolute respect for her quiet soul was a beautiful, shattering revelation. He was actively forcing the cruel world to validate her true worth. A profound, overwhelming sense of absolute emotional safety cemented deeply within her compassionate heart. She realized the stoic protector would never abandon her to the cruel prejudices of the frightened mob. She stepped confidently out of the deep shadows, walking through the cold mud to stand proudly beside the massive protector. Two towering, lonely giants facing the bitter hatred of the ignorant world. Pride is a heavy, dangerous anchor. It drags frightened men down into the deep, black water of their own destruction. The tall farmer looked at the towering woman, his face twisting with a deep, unbreakable prejudice. The crowd murmured with dark, bitter anger, unable to humble themselves before the misunderstood outcast. Suddenly, a loud, terrifying crack echoed from the back of the crowded wagons. A desperate, violent man hidden within the chaotic crowd unleashed a deadly strike. A flaming arrow arced violently through the gray morning sky, leaving a thick trail of dark smoke against the pale clouds. The burning projectile flew high over the massive shoulders of the unyielding blacksmith. The flaming tip struck the dry, heavy timber of the high forge roof with a loud, sickening thud. The hungry fire immediately caught the dry moss of the wooden shingles. The angry flame spread rapidly, roaring to life above the quiet sanctuary. The absolute destruction of the safe haven had begun. Would the two towering giants stay and fight the desperate mob for the burning property? Or would they run into the freezing wilderness to save their own lives? The hungry orange flames devoured the dry timber of the forge roof with a terrifying, rhythmic roar. The heat radiating from the burning structure was intense, forcing the desperate mob of the valley to stumble backward, their faces pale with a sudden, dawning horror. They sought to drive the healer out, but they had not intended to destroy the sanctuary that anchored their own fragile security. The blacksmith was a man of necessary labor. Without his fire, the tools of the valley would rust, and the wagons would break. Winona stood in the wet mud, the solid red fabric of her simple dress stained with black soot. She watched the heavy iron anvil disappear behind a curtain of swirling, toxic smoke. The loss was a physical blow to her heart. This place was the first sight of true peace she had known in many long, grueling years. Gideon did not look at the fire. He moved with an abrupt, powerful grace, grabbing the heavy leather pack containing his iron chisels and his personal belongings. He reached out with his massive, bulging arm, gripping the strong hand of the wild woman. "We cannot stay," he growled. The low, vibrating tone of his voice barely audible over the crackling wood. "The fire will draw the law. They will not stop until they have blood." He pulled her into the dark, protective embrace of the ancient pine forest. They moved with the efficient, quiet speed of two giants who knew the treacherous terrain of the high mountains better than they knew the hearts of men. Behind them, the forge collapsed into a heap of glowing, ruined timber, sending a fountain of bright sparks into the gray morning sky. They hiked for hours, climbing higher into the rugged, unforgiving peaks where the air grew thin and the wind bit into their skin. The adrenaline of the escape slowly faded, leaving behind the heavy, soul-crushing weight of their reality. They were homeless, pursued, and burdened by the horrifying truth of the poisoning river. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged horizon, Gideon stopped near a high, hidden ridge that overlooked the distant, hazy outline of the valley. He released the hand of the healer, his shoulders slumping under the weight of an invisible, heavy burden. The massive, bulging muscles of his physique seemed to contract, as if he were trying to shrink away from the scrutiny of the world. He walked to the edge of the cliff, staring down at the winding path of the river, the dark water looking like a ribbon of ink against the green earth. He turned to look at Winona. The sharp, serious features of his weathered face were twisted in a way the healer had never seen. The stoic protector was gone, replaced by a man drowning in a lifetime of hidden grief. "You believe I am a simple man of iron," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across stone. "You believe I am merely a blacksmith who sought the quiet solitude of the mountain to forget the world." Winona stepped closer, the massive, muscular frame of her body poised and ready to offer comfort. She remained silent, allowing the heavy truth to find its own voice. "I am the one who built the cage," he confessed, the words tearing from his chest with a jagged, painful intensity. "I am not merely a blacksmith. I was the master metalworker for the mine owners years ago. I forged the sluices. I crafted the heavy iron grates that filter the runoff from the ore. I knew the chemicals were toxic. I saw the yellow sludge turning the riverbed into a grave. But I did not stop. I did not speak. I accepted their gold, and I forged the tools of their greed." The silence that followed was absolute. The wind carried the distant, haunting sound of a mountain hawk. Winona looked at the massive hands of the man who had protected her, the hands she had watched shape delicate iron hooks with such profound, gentle care. Those same hands had built the infrastructure of the very sickness that was now killing the children of the valley. "I built the ruin," Gideon continued, his eyes burning with the cold, sharp light of self-loathing. "When I could no longer look at the dead fish floating in the water, I fled. I believed that by hiding here, by hammering simple horseshoes and mending simple plows, I could purchase my own redemption. I was a fool. I built the foundation of the town's destruction. The lawmen did not know, but the mine owners certainly remember my name. The sickness is not an accident of nature. It is the natural consequence of the iron I shaped." The paradigm shift was total. The stoic, mysterious protector was not a victim of the world. He was a silent, guilty participant in its corruption. Winona felt no surge of hatred. She felt only a profound, aching pity for the man who had spent his entire life trying to hammer his own soul into something worthy of forgiveness. She reached out, placing her large, calloused hand upon the thick, muscular shoulder of the aging giant. She felt him flinch, not from the touch, but from the unbearable weight of the truth he had carried alone for so long. "The forge was not your home," she whispered, her voice melodic and steady, cutting through his self-recrimination. "It was your penance. You tried to build a wall against your past with iron, but iron rusts. Gideon, redemption is not found in what we build, but in what we choose to destroy when the truth comes to light." He looked at her, his dark eyes shimmering with a rare, terrifying vulnerability. The stoic wall had finally collapsed. He was no longer the protector of the forge. He was a man standing at a crossroads of his own making. "We cannot go back," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "But the town is dying. The poisoning will not stop until the main valves are breached. I know where they are, and I know how to break them, but I cannot do it alone." He looked toward the northern peaks, where the jagged mountains grew even steeper and more dangerous. "There is a place," he whispered, the intensity of his tone shifting to something like hope. "The Valley of Whispers. It is a hidden, lush basin tucked behind the highest glacier, untouched by the mines, untouched by the law. It is the only place we can survive if we choose to run. But it is a treacherous path, and the weather is turning. Will you follow me into the deep ice, or will you turn back to face the judgment of the men who burned our home?" He stood waiting, his massive, scarred frame braced for the rejection he felt he deserved. The open loop of their future hung in the chilling mountain air. Would they seek the safety of the valley, or would the weight of his past pull them both down into the abyss? The mountain path became a treacherous ribbon of freezing sludge and jagged granite. Gideon had managed to salvage a small, heavy-wheeled supply cart from the ruins of the forge, loading it with the bare essentials: dried meat, a coil of thick rope, the blacksmith's remaining tools, and the precious, fragile vials of the healer. The cart was built for the flat, dry roads of the valley, not for the steep, vertical incline of the high pass. The wheels groaned under the weight, the wood complaining in the biting wind. They moved with the desperate, measured caution of two fugitives. The massive, muscular frames of the two giants were coated in a fine layer of gray sleet. Their breath hung in the freezing air like thick, white ghosts. They did not speak. Words were unnecessary in the face of the overwhelming physical demand of the climb. They communicated through the subtle, unspoken language of the trail, the shifting of a gaze, the firm grip on the heavy guide ropes, the careful placement of feet upon the slick, shifting scree. The trail narrowed sharply where the path skirted the edge of a frozen stream. A deep, murky patch of mud, churned by the recent rainfall, waited like a hungry maw. As Gideon guided the cart across, the left wheel sank deep into the treacherous, sucking earth. The sudden jolt brought the cart to a violent halt, the axle burying itself in the cold, wet sludge. Gideon cursed, the sound low and frustrated in his throat. He threw his weight against the side of the wooden frame, the massive, bulging muscles of his shoulders and thick arms straining against the heavy load. His boots slipped on the icy rocks. He shoved again, the cords of his neck standing out like steel cables. But the cart did not budge. The mud held the wood with a hateful, iron grip. Winona moved instantly to the opposite side. She did not hesitate. The sheer physical power radiating from the giant, muscular woman was a breathtaking sight. She planted her feet wide, the heavy leather boots digging into the slick ground. She placed her shoulder against the rear frame of the cart, her form-fitting dress stretching over the powerful, rippling muscles of her back and thighs. Together, she murmured, her voice steady and calm against the rising howl of the wind. They pushed in perfect, rhythmic synchronization. Gideon provided the raw, explosive strength of a lifetime of smithing, while Winona offered the focused, enduring leverage of a mountain survivor. The cart trembled. The wood groaned in agony. Their muscles, corded and thick with years of hardship, worked in unison, two massive engines of humanity fighting the unyielding gravity of the peak. Gideon looked at her, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of intense concentration and growing, profound admiration. He had spent his life observing the fragility of others, watching the townspeople break under the slightest physical burden. Seeing the towering, wildly muscular woman hold her own against the weight of the mountain was a revelation that stripped away the last of his solitary, stoic armor. She was not merely a healer of wounds, she was a partner of steel. Now, he grunted, the heavy effort pulling the breath from his broad chest. They heaved one final, desperate time. The cart lurched, the wood screeching as it broke free from the mud. It surged forward, the wheels rolling onto the stable rock of the narrow path. They stumbled together, the sudden release of pressure throwing them off balance. Gideon caught Winona by the waist, his massive hands spanning the solid, muscular curve of her back. She braced her large hands against the thick, warm wool of his coat to steady them both. They stood there for a long moment, the freezing rain falling around them, entirely unaware of the cold. The physical intimacy of the moment was heavy, electric, and entirely undeniable. They were two broken giants, cast out by the world, finding a strange, fierce belonging in the shared exhaustion of the climb. For the first time, Gideon did not pull away. He did not retreat into the dark, protective shadow of his own guilt. He held the gaze of the healer, his sharp, serious face softening into an expression of raw, unmasked gratitude. He reached out and wiped a smear of wet, black mud from her cheek, his thumb lingering on the strong, feminine line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, as if he expected the moment to shatter like thin glass. "You are stronger than the mountain," he whispered. The low, deep vibration of his voice resonating through the damp air. Winona did not look down. She leaned into his touch, the warmth of his large, weathered hand acting as a beacon in the biting cold. "We are only strong because we do not have to carry the weight alone." The silence that followed was not the lonely, empty silence of the forge. It was a silence filled with the heavy, pulsing promise of a new life. They were moving closer to the hidden valley, closer to the sanctuary where the ghosts of his past might finally be laid to rest. Gideon took the lead again, gripping the ropes of the cart. They continued the arduous ascent, the path winding through a dense thicket of ancient, twisted pines. The mist was thick, obscuring the world beyond a few yards, creating an intimate, closed-off reality where only the two of them existed. As they rounded a sharp bend in the trail, a sound shattered the quiet rhythm of their breathing. It was not the wind. It was not the shifting of the ice. It was a sharp, distinct, and unmistakable sound, a single gunshot echoing violently through the canyon, followed by the whistle of a lead ball, striking a nearby stone with a high-pitched ring. They dove instantly, Gideon throwing himself over the cart to protect the medicine, while Winona flattened herself against the cold, jagged rock face of the mountain wall. The peaceful ascent had ended. The hunt had moved from the valley to the peaks. Someone was tracking them through the blinding storm, and the hunter knew exactly where they were headed. Who had managed to climb this high, and how did they know the path to the valley? The high-pitched whine of the lead ball, striking the granite wall, filled the narrow canyon. Winona did not scream. The giant woman moved with the instinct of a wild predator, grabbing the heavy harness of the cart and pulling it beneath the shallow overhang of a limestone ledge. Gideon reacted with the same desperate precision, abandoning the cart and tackling the healer to the cold, hard earth. They rolled together into the dark, shallow cavity of a cave, the stone floor biting into their heavy clothes. The roar of the mountain wind suddenly vanished, replaced by the damp, oppressive silence of the subterranean dark. Outside, the storm transformed instantly from a freezing rain into a blinding, savage blizzard. The white curtain of snow swallowed the world, erasing the trail, the sky, and the unseen hunter. They were trapped. Gideon pushed himself up, his sharp, serious eyes scanning the jagged entrance. He did not look for the hunter. He looked at the massive, shivering form of the healer. The air within the cave was frigid, the temperature dropping with every passing minute of the violent storm. He reached into his heavy pack, retrieving a small bundle of dry kindling he had kept wrapped in oilcloth. With numb, fumbling fingers, he struck a spark against the flint. A tiny, flickering orange flame bloomed, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough walls of the cave. They moved closer to the heat, the narrow space forcing them into a proximity that felt heavy with unvoiced emotion. Gideon pulled a thick, wool blanket from the pack and draped it over the broad, muscular shoulders of the woman. She looked up at him, her resolute face illuminated by the fragile light, and she saw the profound exhaustion etched into the lines of his weathered, tanned skin. She pulled the blanket further, motioning for him to sit beside her. They sat shoulder to shoulder, the massive, bulging muscles of the blacksmith pressed against the strong, powerful frame of the healer. This was not the comfort of a warm forge. This was the desperate, survival-based closeness of two souls who had fought the entire world just to exist. The loss of my people was not caused by fire, Winona murmured, her voice soft and melodic, barely audible above the howling blizzard outside. She stared into the small fire, the memories of her past flickering in the flames. It was caused by a creeping silence. The tribe of my youth lived in the high canyons. We were keepers of the old medicines, healers of the deep forests. When the men of the valley came, they did not bring swords. They brought a sickness of the blood. They brought a hunger for the earth beneath our feet. We could not fight a shadow. We could not heal a spirit that had already withered from despair. The giant woman paused, the pain of the ancient memory tightening the heavy muscles of her broad chest. I walked away from the graves of the canyon because I carried the knowledge of the elders. I believed that if I could heal the people of the New World, I could prevent the same silence from spreading. I failed. The people of the valley do not want healing. They want to be told their choices are not the cause of their pain. Gideon listened, the heavy weight of his own guilt pressing down upon his broad shoulders. He felt the profound, tragic resonance of her words. He had been the one who built the tools of the valley. He had been the silence. I did not protect the forge, Gideon whispered, the deep, vibrating tone of his voice ragged with shame. I merely used the iron to build a cage for my own cowardice. You seek to save the world, Winona. I only sought to hide from it. He reached out, his large, calloused hand finding hers. The contact was electric, a sudden, burning bridge between the two lonely giants. The fear of the hunter outside, the freezing cold, and the exhaustion of the climb faded into the background. The only reality was the steady, rhythmic pulse of the other. The emotional significance of the moment reached a peak. They were no longer two fugitives hiding from the law. They were two people acknowledging the broken parts of their souls, finding the first, fragile threads of true connection. "You do not hide anymore," she whispered, squeezing his hand with her strong, massive fingers. "You stood in the mud. You faced the fire. That is not the action of a coward." Gideon opened his mouth to reply, but the words died in his throat. A violent, racking cough seized his broad chest, shaking his massive, powerful frame. He turned away, clutching his side, the sudden intensity of the seizure startling the quiet cave. He doubled over, gasping for air, the muscles of his back spasming under the thin fabric of his shirt. Winona moved instantly, her hands flying to his back, her touch professional and steady, despite the alarm rising in her heart. She felt the skin of his back. It was unnaturally hot. A burning, dry heat radiated from him, a fever that had nothing to do with the exertion of the climb. She looked at him, her eyes searching his pale, sweating face. She saw the familiar, terrible signs she had seen in the children of the valley. The sickness was not merely of the mind or the spirit. It was in the blood. "Gideon," she breathed, the terror finally breaking through her calm demeanor. "The water from the river. When did you last drink from the stream at the base of the mine?" Gideon looked at her, his eyes clouded with a sudden, devastating haze. He coughed again, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from deep within the core of his massive chest. "I washed my hands," he murmured, his voice faint and trembling. "I drank from the bucket before we left the forge. I thought the deep well was safe." He collapsed onto the dirt, the strength of the giant blacksmith failing him completely. His massive, muscular body went limp, his eyes fluttering shut. The terrible, unnatural heat of the poison from the mine had finally caught up to the man who built the grates that allowed it to flow. The silence of the cave returned, but it was now heavy with the suffocating threat of death. The blizzard continued to scream outside, locking them in this dark, freezing tomb. Winona knelt beside him, the vast, powerful muscles of her thighs bracing her against the sudden, devastating weight of the situation. She had the knowledge of the elders. She had the roots in her bag. But she did not have the one thing required for the cure. She remembered the ancient legend of the peaks. At the highest point of the jagged ridge, above the tree line where the ice never melted, grew the silver root. It was the only medicine potent enough to break the deep, dark fever of the mine poison. She looked at the blizzard raging outside the cave entrance. She looked at the man who had protected her with his life, the man who was now dying because of his own past. What choice did the giant healer have? Could she survive the climb to the frozen peak? And would the man who had finally opened his heart survive the night? Or had she arrived at the edge of the world only to watch him fade into the snow? The deep, chilling darkness of the cave felt like a tomb. Gideon lay curled upon the hard stone, his massive frame shivering uncontrollably as the unnatural, burning heat of the mine poison ravaged his body. His sharp, angular face was pale, glistening, with a cold, sticky sweat that did not match the fever blistering beneath his skin. The terrifying rattle in his chest grew louder with every labored breath, a sound that sliced through the heart of the healer with more precision than any blade. Winona knelt beside him, her massive, wildly muscular hands moving with a frantic, desperate efficiency. She had removed her own heavy wool coat, draping the thick fabric over the shivering shoulders of the blacksmith. She ignored the biting, frigid air of the cave that seeped into her own skin, Her only concern was the man who had traded his own strength to ensure her safety. He was a giant of a man, a mountain of iron and resilience, yet lying there in the flickering light of the dying fire, he appeared hauntingly fragile. The role reversal was absolute. The protector had become the protected. The blacksmith who had forged walls of safety against the cruel world was now entirely dependent upon the very woman he had sworn to save. Winona felt a deep, wrenching ache in the powerful muscles of her chest. It was not a physical pain, but the sharp, overwhelming fear of a world suddenly devoid of his presence. She realized then that the silence of the forge, the rhythm of his hammer, and the solid, unshakable boundary of his back had become the only constants in her turbulent life. She gathered the remaining dry wood, feeding the fire until the flames danced high against the stone ceiling. She could not leave him here without warmth, yet she could not stay and watch him wither away into nothingness. The legend of the silver root was no longer a myth of the forest elders. It was the only remaining thread of hope. The ridge above the tree line, where the wind screamed with the ferocity of a wild beast, was the only place such medicine could survive the brutal, poisoned environment. "Stay with the fire," she whispered, her voice cracking, though he could not hear her words through the thick haze of his delirium. She bent over him, her forehead resting against his burning skin for one fleeting, desperate heartbeat. She traced the line of his jaw with her thumb, a silent, heartbroken promise. She stood to her full, towering height, her red dress pulled tight against the immense, rippling muscles of her frame. She checked the simple, woven bag at her waist, finding the small, sharp blade she used for harvesting. She did not hesitate. The blizzard raged outside, a wall of white death that sought to bury anyone foolish enough to challenge the peak. Winona stepped out of the mouth of the cave. The world exploded in a violent, icy chaos. The wind struck her like a physical blow, howling against the massive, muscular structure of her shoulders, threatening to throw her from the narrow ledge. The snow blinded her, stinging her skin with the force of needle-sharp ice. She bowed her head, her thick, blonde-streaked hair whipping about her resolute face. She moved with a deliberate, low center of gravity, her heavy leather boots finding purchase on the slick, hidden rocks. The climb was a brutal, unrelenting torture. Every step required the full exertion of her powerful legs, the muscles in her thighs burning with the effort to push against the gale. The air was thin, tasting of iron and frost, and it clawed at her lungs with every jagged breath. She climbed blindly, guided only by the ancient, ancestral instinct of the mountain healer. She knew the path not by sight, but by the pressure of the air and the slant of the stone. She was a giant of a woman, physically imposing and hardened by a life of struggle. Yet against the raw, unbridled fury of the mountain, she felt small, insignificant, and terrifyingly mortal. Her fear was not for herself. It was a suffocating, heavy dread that she would not return in time. She envisioned the forge, the smell of burnt iron, the quiet safety of the blacksmith's touch, and the thought of that warmth being extinguished forever fueled her limbs with a desperate, frantic energy. She hauled herself up a sheer, icy face, her fingers raw and bleeding from the grip on the frozen granite. She did not feel the cold. She did not feel the pain. She felt only the terrifying, empty silence that would descend if she failed. As she breached the final, jagged ridge of the peak, the wind died down to a low, mournful whistle. Before her, clinging to the side of a deep, crystalline crevasse, shimmered a cluster of faint, silvery leaves. The silver root. It glowed with a pale, ethereal light, defiant against the killing frost. Winona scrambled toward the edge, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached out, her massive, calloused hand hovering over the prize, her fingers trembling with the weight of the moment. Just as her skin brushed the frozen soil, the ground beneath her shifted. A low, ominous rumble vibrated through the earth, a sound that had nothing to do with the wind. The ice beneath the crevasse cracked with the sound of a shattering mountain, the fissure widening rapidly as the stability of the ridge failed under the sheer weight of the storm. She watched, paralyzed, as the silver root slipped further away, dangling precariously over the dark, yawning abyss. If she jumped, she might reach the medicine, but the ice would likely shatter entirely, sending her into the black void below. If she stayed, the medicine would slide into the darkness, and the man waiting in the cave would surely die. She stood on the crumbling edge, the massive, muscular silhouette of her body framed against the pale, swirling snow. The choice was clear, yet the cost was absolute. She braced her legs, the steel-like muscles of her calves bunching as she prepared to leap into the maw of the storm. Would the earth hold long enough for her to secure the cure, or would she be buried on the peak, leaving the man who saved her to wake up alone in the dark? The mountain ledge groaned beneath the massive weight of the healer. Winona did not hesitate. The muscles in her powerful thighs coiled like tight, braided steel. She launched her towering body across the yawning, black crevasse, her form a solid, red blur against the white fury of the storm. She landed with a bone-jarring thud on the crumbling ice shelf, her large, calloused hands slamming into the freezing slush to anchor her momentum. The ice beneath her shrieked in protest. Long, spiderweb fractures racing outward from her point of impact. She did not look down into the void. She reached forward, her fingers closing firmly around the stems of the glowing silver root. She yanked the plant free, pulling the cool, trembling life from the grip of the mountain just as the shelf collapsed into the abyss with a deafening roar. She tumbled backward, the jagged rock biting into her shoulder, her boots sliding dangerously close to the new, sheer edge. She lay there for a moment, the heavy, ragged breath of the survivor tearing from her lungs. The silver root clutched tightly against the solid red fabric of her dress. The danger was not over. The path back to the cave was now a labyrinth of shattered ice and shifting scree. She forced her body to move. Every muscle in her massive frame protested the exertion, the extreme cold turning her skin to a numb, heavy weight. She began the descent, her movements deliberate and slow. She was a giant of a woman, physically designed for endurance. Yet the climb back down tested the absolute limits of her spirit. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the steady, rhythmic persistence of the soul when the body begs for rest. She navigated the darkness by the feel of the wind and the orientation of the jagged peaks. When she finally reached the narrow ledge of the cave, the blizzard had not relented. She crawled through the opening, the warmth of the fire hitting her frozen skin like a physical blow. She tumbled onto the dirt floor, the exhaustion of the climb finally claiming the strength of her legs. Gideon lay exactly where she had left him. The massive blacksmith was still, his chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular gasps. The fever had worsened. The skin of his face flushed a dangerous, unnatural crimson. He was lost in the dark, suffocating haze of the sickness. Winona scrambled to his side, her movements precise and focused. She placed the silver root into a stone mortar, using a heavy, smooth rock to crush the glowing leaves into a fine, aromatic paste. The sharp, clean scent of the medicine filled the damp air, a stark, beautiful contrast to the stale, metallic smell of the infection. She lifted his heavy head, resting it against her lap. His hair was matted with sweat, his skin burning beneath her touch. The giant man, the protector who had shielded her from the hatred of the valley and the harshness of the mountain, was fading. She felt the terrifying, silent decline of his vitality. She brushed his tangled hair away from his forehead, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. The vulnerability of the moment shattered the final, lingering walls of her heart. "I have returned," she whispered, her voice melodic and steady, a beacon of calm in the encroaching dark. She took a small portion of the silver paste, pressing it against his cracked, pale lips. She dipped her finger in the water barrel and helped him swallow, the mixture sliding down his throat. Gideon gasped, his body arching instinctively against the sudden, cold sensation of the potent root. He remained unconscious, but the rhythmic, rattling sound in his chest shifted. It grew slower, deeper. Winona continued to administer the medicine, her large, steady hands working with the infinite patience of a woman who was fighting for the life of the only soul who had ever truly seen her. She sat in the dim light of the dying fire, watching his face. She watched the twitching of his eyelids, the subtle tension in his massive hands. She monitored the warmth of his skin, the frantic pulse at his neck, and the erratic rhythm of his heart. She became a guardian of his breath. Hours bled into the deep, frozen night. The storm continued to howl outside, a relentless, violent entity. But inside the cave, the only sound was the crackling fire and the heavy, measured breathing of the two giants. The exhaustion finally pulled at her own eyes. She leaned back against the rough stone wall, her arm draped protectively across the massive, muscular shoulder of the blacksmith. She felt the solid, unyielding strength of his frame, even in his sickness. It was a comfort she had never known, a physical anchor that made the vast, cruel world feel small and manageable. She closed her eyes for a fleeting second. The image of the silver root burned into her mind like a promise. She did not know how long she drifted. The silence of the cave was broken by a sudden, sharp intake of air. It was not a rattle. It was a conscious, deep breath that filled the lungs with purpose. Winona's eyes snapped open. She looked down, her heart hammering against her ribs. Gideon's chest was still. The movement had stopped. The feverish flush of his skin seemed to vanish, leaving him pale and motionless in the flickering firelight. The medicine had worked, or it had been too late. The silence that filled the small chamber was heavier than the blizzard outside. She reached out, her hand trembling, and pressed her fingers against the hollow of his neck, searching for the sign of the life she had risked everything to save. He remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. The weight of the world felt as if it were collapsing onto the small, dark space. Had she returned from the peak of the mountain, only to be greeted by the final, cold stillness of the man who had taught her the meaning of sanctuary? The hollow silence of the cave stretched thin, the air thick with the scent of pine smoke and damp stone. Winona held her breath, her fingers pressing firmly against the hollow of his throat. A single, rhythmic thrum met her skin. It was slow, hesitant, but it was unmistakably the steady beat of a living heart. She let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension leaving her body as if a heavy chain had been cut from her soul. Gideon stirred. His massive, muscular frame shifted against the hard floor, the thick leather of his trousers scraping softly against the grit. He opened his dark eyes, the clarity within them foggy and distant. He looked up, his gaze finding the strong, resolute face of the woman who held him. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry, rasping sound that caught in his throat. Winona moved quickly, lifting his head to offer the last of the cool water from the skin. He drank with a desperate thirst, his large, calloused hands gripping her wrist to steady himself. The fever had broken. The unnatural, burning heat that had consumed his body had finally retreated, leaving behind the exhaustion of a man who had stared into the void and returned. They remained in the cave for 2 full days as the blizzard raged and finally exhausted its fury. The storm left the high peaks cloaked in a pristine, blinding blanket of white. When the wind finally settled into a quiet, cold whisper, they emerged into a world that felt entirely new. The journey over the final ridge was a grueling test of endurance. Gideon was weakened, his massive, bulging physique leaner and more gaunt, but he moved with a grim, determined grace. Winona walked beside him, her powerful, muscular thighs pushing through the deep, drifted snow, her arms slung around his waist to provide a physical anchor against the dizzying heights. They crested the final, jagged pass just as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. Below them lay the Valley of Whispers. It was a secret, hidden basin sheltered by a ring of impenetrable peaks, a lush sanctuary untouched by the iron reach of the mines or the toxic rot of the valley. A crystalline river wound through the center of the valley, lined with tall, vibrant willows and soft, emerald grass that had been spared the ravages of the winter frost. It was a place of impossible, serene beauty. They descended into the basin in silence, their footsteps leaving the first marks in the virgin snow of the floor. As they reached the edge of the river, the air grew noticeably warmer, a natural, sheltered pocket of life that defied the freezing climate of the high ridges. They began to build a life. It was a slow, primitive existence, but it was theirs. They cleared a small patch of land near a freshwater spring. Using the remaining tools Gideon had salvaged to construct a sturdy, timber-framed cabin. They worked with the intuitive, unspoken coordination of 2 partners who understood the value of every movement. Gideon hauled the heavy logs, his immense strength returning as he labored, while Winona prepared the land, the earth responding to her touch as she planted the seed she had carried in her bag. The intimacy of their new life was not spoken, it was felt in the small, daily moments. It was the way he ensured the fire was banked high before she woke, or the way she placed a warm, wet cloth on his hands after he finished the heavy labor of the day. They were 2 broken giants, finding their dignity in the construction of a home. One crisp, clear morning, several weeks after their arrival, the thaw began to reveal the dark, rich soil of the valley floor. Winona stood near the edge of the clearing, her large, calloused hands resting upon her hips, admiring the first shoots of green emerging from the earth. She heard the soft crunch of heavy boots on the damp grass and turned to see Gideon walking toward her, his chest bare, the muscles of his back glistening in the morning light. He stopped, his sharp, serious face scanning the tree line, a sudden, unfamiliar tension tightening his jaw. He moved toward the muddy bank of the stream, his eyes fixed on a specific, disturbed patch of earth near the water. Winona walked to his side, her brow furrowing. She looked down at the mud. There, pressed deep into the soft earth, were the distinct, heavy prints of a shod horse. The tracks were fresh, the mud still moist around the edges of the iron shoes. They were not the wandering tracks of a wild animal, nor were they the old, weather-worn marks of a long-past traveler. These were intentional, focused, and recent. Gideon knelt, his large, rough hand hovering over the prints. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. The profound peace of the valley shattered in an instant. Someone had crossed the impossible ridges. Someone knew the location of the secret valley. As they stood in the silent meadow, the wind carried a faint, rhythmic sound from the far side of the forest, the sharp, metallic click of a rifle hammer being cocked. They were not alone in the sanctuary. Who had managed to track them through the blizzard? And what did the intruder want from the two people who had risked everything to disappear? The sharp, metallic click of the rifle hammer echoed against the silence of the hidden valley. A cold reminder that the peace of the basin was not a fortress. Gideon moved with the speed of a striking viper, his massive body lunging to block the line of sight between the weapon and the healer. He did not grab his hammer, he did not reach for a weapon. He stood tall, the bulging muscles of his back tense beneath his shirt, his dark eyes scanning the dense line of willows. "Step out," Gideon rumbled, the low tone of his voice vibrating with dangerous, controlled power. "There is no profit in stalking us." The foliage parted, not with the grace of a hunter, but with the clumsy, stumbling weight of a broken man. The town sheriff stepped into the sunlight. He was not the arrogant, polished lawman who had demanded justice at the forge. His long coat hung loosely on a frame that had wasted away. His face was gaunt, and his eyes were hollow, sunken pits of profound, unbearable fatigue. He held the rifle with a hand that trembled with a violent, persistent tremor. He did not point the barrel toward them. He lowered it, the heavy metal clattering as it fell into the soft grass, and he sank to his knees. "The valley is empty," the sheriff rasped, his voice a dry, papery sound that carried no threat. "The streets are silent. There is no law left to enforce." Winona stepped from behind the massive, unyielding wall of the blacksmith. The sight of the lawman, stripped of his authority and his vitality, sent a shiver of realization through her heart. She looked at the man who had ordered the burning of her sanctuary, the man who had driven them into the freezing mountains, and she felt only the crushing weight of a universal tragedy. "You followed us," Gideon murmured, his gaze remaining locked on the sheriff, his large, muscular hands curling into fists at his sides. "I tracked the horse," the sheriff whispered, pressing his forehead into the earth. "I followed the trail of the two giants who did not fear the cold. I had to. There is no one else." The sheriff looked up, his hollow eyes meeting those of the blacksmith. He reached into his coat and produced a folded, weathered document. He did not stand. He simply held the paper toward them, his fingers clutching the edge of the parchment, with a desperate, frantic intensity. "The mine has breached the primary aquifer," the sheriff admitted, the confession dragging out of him like teeth from a jaw. "The water is not just tainted. It is dead. The children are sleeping, and they are not waking up. The town doctor has fled with the silver. The mine owners have locked the gates and abandoned the tunnels. They took their gold and left the people to wither in the dark." Gideon did not take the paper. He stared at the sheriff, the internal war visible in the tightening of his jaw and the erratic rise and fall of his broad, heavily muscled chest. "Why come here?" Gideon breathed, his voice thick with the memory of the forge fire. "Why seek the people you branded as outcasts?" "Because," the sheriff breathed, tears carving clean, bright paths through the grime on his face. The healer is the only one who knows the truth of the sickness, and the blacksmith is the only one who knows how to open the iron valves of the mine's main basin. If you do not return, there will be no one left to bury by the end of the week. The sheriff opened his palm, revealing the document. It was a formal decree of pardon, signed by the remaining town elders, promising a full restoration of rights, a deed to the forge, and a permanent, protected status for the healer. It was a cruel joke turned into a desperate, final destiny. They were being offered everything they had once begged for. Only at the moment, they had finally learned to live without it. Winona stood in the center of the meadow, the lush, green beauty of the valley framing her powerful, resolute form. She looked at the man who had brought the poison of the town into their sanctuary. She thought of the cold, hungry nights on the ridge. She thought of the silver root and the quiet, sacred peace of the cabin they had built with their own hands. To return was to invite the chaos back into her life. To return was to risk the man she had learned to love, for the sake of people who had once cheered for her destruction. "Do you understand what you ask?" Winona murmured, her voice steady, melodic, and cold. "You ask us to walk back into the mouth of the fire that burned us out. I ask you to save the people who were too blind to see the truth." The sheriff groaned, the desperation in his voice shattering into a sob. "I ask you to save my daughter. She is 7. She is all that is left." The mention of the child was a physical strike. Gideon looked at the sheriff, and then he looked at Winona. The blacksmith's face was a map of his own history, the guilt of the iron he had forged, the shadow of the mines he had once called home, and the dawning realization of his own capacity for change. He had built the cage, and now he held the only key to breaking it. "The town burned the forge," Gideon rumbled, his voice low, vibrating with the weight of his decision. "They destroyed the life I tried to build for myself. If we return, we will not be returning as outcasts. We will be returning as the only ones who can fix the damage." Winona walked to Gideon, placing her large, calloused hand upon his massive, bulging forearm. The heat of his skin, the strength of his frame, and the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart were the only things that anchored her to the world. They were equals. They were partners. They were two giants who had been tested by the fire and the ice, and they were the only ones who possessed the power to right the wrong. "We cannot leave the child," Winona whispered, her eyes softening as she looked at the sheriff. "But we cannot promise that we will stay." The sheriff slumped, a broken, empty vessel, grateful for even the smallest mercy. He knew he had no right to demand more. Gideon reached down, his large fingers gripping the paper, the parchment crinkling in his massive, scarred palm. He did not look at the pardon. He looked at the vast, distant horizon where the jagged mountains met the sky, and beyond that, the dying town that had once been his own private hell. The emotional consequence of this choice was absolute. If they returned, the peace of the valley would be lost forever. If they stayed, the secret guilt of the mine would remain, a poison that would slowly seep into their own legacy, even in this hidden paradise. The stakes were no longer about survival. They were about the legacy of their lives. Gideon and Winona turned toward the path leading back out of the sanctuary. They stood shoulder to shoulder, two towering figures prepared to face the catastrophe they had once helped to build. As they began the arduous trek back toward the valley, the question loomed, heavy and suffocating in the mountain air. Could they destroy the source of the poison without losing their own souls in the process? The walk back to the town was a journey through the valley of the shadow of death. The lush greenery of the mountain slopes slowly gave way to the sickly, yellowish grass of the lowlands. The air grew heavy, smelling of sulfur, stagnant water, and the quiet decay of a place losing its will to survive. As the two giants descended the final ridge, the town appeared as a ghost of its former self. The once bustling streets were empty, the shutters of the wooden homes pulled tight against the light of day. There was no joy, no greeting, and no hostility. There was only the profound, suffocating silence of a community waiting for the end. When the people of the valley saw the massive, towering figures of the blacksmith and the healer walking toward the town square, the reaction was not one of rage, but of stunned disbelief. Men and women emerged from the shadows of their porches, their faces gaunt and gray, their eyes wide with the realization that the people they had driven away were the only hope remaining. Gideon did not look at them. He walked with a heavy, purposeful stride, his eyes fixed on the distant, dark mouth of the mining complex that loomed over the northern slope. The core loop was revealed in the quiet, grim determination of his movements. He had not merely been an employee of the mine. He had been the architect of the pressure valves, the designer of the subterranean sluices, and the builder of the very systems that now suffocated the river. He carried the burden of the design flaw not as a secret of shame, but as a map of the destruction he was now destined to undo. The main pressure valve is located in the primary control chamber, Gideon explained, his voice low and devoid of emotion as they stood at the threshold of the mine. I designed the system with a secondary fail-safe. I intended it to be a safety measure, a way to purge the system if the pressure became critical. The owners sealed it shut to save costs, to force the water through the main outflow. The pressure has built up for years. If I break the seal from the inside, the buildup will vent safely, but the structural integrity of the entire chamber will be compromised. The mine will collapse. Winona listened, her resolute face a mask of absolute trust. She looked at the towering, massive man beside her. He was not just returning to fix a mistake. He was returning to destroy the legacy of his own hubris. The mine is your home. In a way, she whispered, her voice gentle and steady. It is my prison, Gideon replied. He turned to her, his sharp, serious face softening for a fleeting moment. I built the bars that locked us all in. It is only right that I pull them down. They descended into the darkness of the mine. The air inside was stifling, hot, and thick with the taste of metallic dust. They navigated the labyrinthine tunnels by the light of a single, flickering lantern. Every step was a dance with potential disaster. The timber beams above them groaned under the weight of the mountain, protesting the shifting pressure of the water, held back by the failing valves. The control chamber was a cathedral of iron and wrought. The main pipe, a massive, rusted vessel of conduit, pulsed with the rhythmic thud of the trapped water. The iron was hot to the touch, vibrating with the immense, agonizing strain of the trapped mountain runoff. Gideon approached the central valve, his massive, heavily muscled arms coiled and ready. He took up his heavy wrench, the tool that had defined his life, and set it against the rusted bolts of the fail-safe. When this breaks, the water will force the collapse of the support pillars, Gideon warned, his voice steady. We will have seconds to reach the egress tunnel. Then we will run together, Winona affirmed. She stood beside him, her massive, powerful form acting as a guard against the falling debris. Gideon gripped the wrench. He pulled, his entire body trembling with the effort. The veins in his thick, bulging forearms stood out like ridges of cable. The rusted iron shrieked, a high, piercing sound of metal yielding to will. The seal cracked. A hiss of escaping steam erupted, hot and blinding. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth, the valve shattered. The trapped water, released from years of agonizing pressure, surged outward. The control chamber shuddered. Massive, ancient wooden beams snapped like dry twigs, and the sound of rock grinding against rock filled the air. The cavern began to bow, the ceiling shedding tons of earth and debris in a sudden, violent rain of stone. "Run," Gideon shouted. Throwing the wrench aside, he grabbed Winona's hand. They did not look back. They surged into the egress tunnel, just as the chamber behind them detonated in a spray of mud, iron, and stone. The collapse was absolute. The earth screamed as the mine succumbed to the force of the mountain. They sprinted, their massive, powerful frames driving them forward, the light of the lantern dancing erratically as the walls of the tunnel warped and buckled. The entrance of the mine was barely visible, a shrinking circle of gray, daylight sky. The floor beneath them heaved, the timber supports failing one after another in a thunderous succession of crashes. A massive boulder plummeted from the roof, slamming into the path in front of them, blocking the narrow passage. Gideon did not stop. He threw his massive shoulder against the stone, the bulging, thick muscles of his physique straining to move the impossible weight. Winona slammed her own body against the rock, their combined strength a singular, overwhelming force of nature. The boulder skidded, grinding against the earth, creating a gap just large enough to squeeze through. They scrambled into the light, tumbling out onto the muddy slope of the mountain. Behind them, the mouth of the mine imploded. The earth shook, a deep, resonant rumble that rippled through the valley. A cloud of thick, choking dust billowed outward, swallowing the entrance entirely, burying the cage Gideon had built so many years ago. They lay in the mud, panting, the silence of the aftermath settling over the valley. The dust began to clear, revealing the jagged scar on the mountainside where the mine had once stood. They had done it. The pressure was gone. The water would drain safely into the lower basin, away from the river, away from the town, and away from the homes of the innocent. Gideon pushed himself up, his weathered, tanned face covered in the gray soot of the mine. He looked at the collapsed earth, and then he looked at Winona. She was alive. She was here. The air in the valley was already beginning to taste cleaner, devoid of the metallic rot that had plagued it for so long. The silence of the valley was broken by the distant, faint sound of a child's laughter. The town was beginning to breathe again. But as the dust settled, the reality of their situation descended upon them. They were covered in the ruin of the mine, exposed and vulnerable, with the eyes of the town upon them. They had saved the community, but they had also destroyed the only economy the town had ever known. Gideon looked at the ruin of his past, and then he reached out, his hand finding the strong, resolute hand of the woman who had guided him home. The mine was gone. The valve was broken. What awaited them when the dust finally cleared, and the people came to find the ones who had shattered their world? The dust that hung above the shattered mine slowly drifted away on the cooling mountain breeze. The townspeople emerged from their homes, their gaunt faces illuminated by the pale, soft light of the setting sun. They did not shout. They did not raise their voices in anger. They stood in the town square, a sea of broken people, looking toward the mountainside where the mine had once dominated the skyline. Gideon and Winona stood in the center of the muddy road, their bodies covered in the gray ash of the explosion, their clothes torn and heavy with the debris of the collapse. They were giants in the eyes of the town now, not because of their size, but because of the terrifying, impossible scale of the sacrifice they had made. The town elders walked forward, their steps hesitant and weighted with a profound, crushing humility. The tall farmer, who had once been the loudest voice, calling for the expulsion of the healer, stood at the front. He looked at the massive, scarred blacksmith, and then at the towering, resolute woman at his side. He held his hat in his hands, his fingers twisting the brim with a nervous, rhythmic motion. He did not speak for a long time. The silence in the square was not the silence of judgment. It was the silence of a desperate, final understanding. "The water is already clearing," the farmer murmured, his voice cracking with an emotion he did not have the words to describe. "The sulfur is gone. The children are drinking. The sickness is breaking." Gideon did not smile. He stood with his broad shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the horizon rather than the people who had once burned his forge. He remained the stoic, unbreakable blacksmith, a man who had forged his own path through the fires of his past. Winona stood beside him, her hand resting firmly against the small of his back, a silent, powerful anchor of support. She did not seek forgiveness from the town. She did not require their validation to know the worth of her soul. She had found her peace, and she had found her place, and it did not lie within the borders of this broken, regretful community. "You have saved the future of the valley," the elder stated, his voice trembling as he stepped closer. "We are ready to restore the forge. We are ready to give the healer the respect of the town. We offer the land. We offer the protection of the law. Stay. Be the heart of this valley." The offer hung in the air, a tempting, comfortable promise of safety and belonging. It was the very thing they had both spent their lives seeking, a place to rest, a place to be accepted, a place to call home. But as Winona looked at the faces of the people, she saw the lingering shadows of their old prejudices. They would welcome the heroes, but would they accept the healers? Would they look past the wildness of her appearance, the strength of her muscles, and the nonconformity of her soul? She looked at Gideon. She saw the answer written in the deep, serious lines of his face. He did not belong to the town anymore. He belonged to the mountain, and he belonged to her. "We do not seek to be the heart of the valley," Winona whispered, her voice melodic and clear, carrying across the silent square. "The heart of the valley belongs to you. You must learn to heal yourselves." Gideon placed his massive, calloused hand over hers. He did not look at the elders again. He turned toward the path that led away from the town, toward the high peaks and the secret, hidden basin of the Valley of Whispers. "The forge is gone," Gideon rumbled, his voice low and vibrating with a final, unbreakable resolve. "The iron is buried. We are not returning to the life we left behind." The townspeople parted, creating a wide, respectful path for the two giants as they walked out of the square. No one stopped them. No one begged them to stay. The weight of their own choices had finally settled upon the shoulders of the town, and they knew, with a sudden, painful clarity, that the giants were right. Salvation could not be gifted by a blacksmith or a healer. It had to be earned by the people who had survived the fire. They walked for hours as the stars began to blanket the sky, a brilliant, crystalline display above the jagged peaks. The ascent was long, but they did not tire. They moved with a lightness that felt like the shedding of a heavy, iron skin. When they reached the entrance of their valley, the air grew warm and fragrant with the scent of the native wildflowers. The river hummed a gentle, rhythmic song against the smooth, polished stones. Their cabin stood in the center of the meadow, a simple, sturdy structure of timber and hope. It was not a fortress, and it was not a palace. It was a home. As they stepped across the threshold, Gideon turned to her. He did not reach for his tools. He did not look for the labor of the day. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a softness that had never known the hardness of the forge. He took both of her large, muscular hands in his own, and for the first time, he did not look away. He pulled her gently toward him, the massive, bulging muscles of his arms shielding her from the world. The solid, unyielding heat of his body, a promise of eternal protection. I have spent my life building things that were meant to endure, he breathed. His voice a low, intimate murmur against her temple. But everything I ever built turned to rust or ash. Until I found you. Winona leaned into him, the massive, powerful frame of her body relaxing completely against his chest. She had been a stranger to love, a wanderer in the wild, a giant among people who feared her strength. But in his arms, she was not a healer, and she was not an outcast. She was simply herself. We are the only things that endure, she whispered, looking up at him with a gaze that held the wisdom of the centuries. The iron breaks. The fire fades. But the choice to stand together is the only medicine that never loses its power. He kissed her, a simple, profound movement that tasted of the mountain air and the promise of a quiet dawn. It was not a confession of words, but a confession of presence. He was there. He was hers. And the valley was theirs to keep. The wind sighed through the willows. A gentle, whispering benediction. They were the masters of their own destiny. Two giants who had walked through the fire and emerged, not as shadows of their past, but as the architects of their own, earned peace. The long journey was over. The scars remained. The memories were etched into their bones. But the weight of the world had been lifted, leaving behind only the soft, endless horizon of their future together. The fire is not merely the burning of wood. It is the burning of the old self to make room for the new. When we look back at the trail we have traveled, we do not see the obstacles that slowed us down. We see the moments where we chose to stand firm. True redemption is not a destination. It is the steady, daily act of choosing kindness over cruelty, understanding over ignorance, and connection over isolation. Our two giants did not find peace because the world finally understood them. They found peace because they finally understood themselves. They discovered that the greatest strength is not found in the muscles that haul the heavy stones, but in the heart that refuses to harden against the suffering of the world. They carried the lessons of the mine and the forge into the new life, using the experience of their past to nurture the growth of their future. The Valley of Whispers remains a place of legend, a hidden pocket of time where the river sings, the trees breathe, and the weight of the world does not reach. Those who seek it rarely find it, for it is not a place you can navigate by a map. It is a place you can only find when you have finished paying your debt to the world and are finally ready to belong to yourself. In the quiet of the mountain dawn, when the mist rises from the river like a breath of prayer, you might hear the rhythm of a hammer against an anvil, not as a sound of labor, but as the heartbeat of a home. It is a reminder that no matter how deep the winter, no matter how cold the night, the warmth of a life earned through courage and sacrifice will always, always endure. The story of the giant healer and the aging blacksmith is not just a memory. It is a whisper carried on the wind, a testament to the truth that love is the only power capable of shattering the chains of the past. May your own journey lead you to the valley you need, and may you have the courage to build your home when you finally arrive. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The characters, organizations, and events depicted are products of the storyteller's imagination and are used for entertainment purposes.